The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. 12-year-old Emma Richardson walked beside her mother, her small hand gripping the familiar fabric of her mother's blazer jacket. The grip was so tight her knuckles had turned white, a physical manifestation of the terror churning inside her stomach. Her golden retriever, Copper, walked with practiced precision on her left side, his leash held loosely but securely in Emma's trembling right hand. 3 months ago, Copper wouldn't have been allowed in this building. But 3 months ago, Emma could still sleep through the night without nightmares. 3 months ago, her parents' marriage was dying, not already dead. The courthouse itself felt like a cathedral of judgment, all echoing footsteps, cold stone, and the weight of decisions that would reshape lives. Emma had been here twice before for preliminary hearings, but this felt different, final, definitive. This was the day that would determine not just legal custody arrangements but the fundamental structure of her existence, where she would wake up each morning, which house would be home, which parent would know her secrets, which one would help her with homework, take her to the dentist, pick her up from school. The permanence of it made her dizzy. Her mother, Richardson, squeezed her shoulders gently, was trying to appear calm, composed, the picture of a stable parent. But Emma could feel the tension radiating through her mother's fingertips. She noticed the slight tremor in her mother's breath. She saw the way her mother's jaw clenched every few seconds, a nervous habit Emma recognized because she'd inherited it. They were both terrified, though neither would say it aloud. "We're going to be okay," whispered, more to herself than to Emma. "The truth is on our side, baby. Remember what we talked about, just tell the truth." Emma nodded mutely, but the knot in her throat wouldn't allow words to pass. How could she explain to the truth when her father had spent months rewriting reality, when his attorneys had crafted narratives from half-truths and misinterpretations? Emma had learned quickly that facts and truth weren't always the same thing. Then she saw him. Her father, Richard Richardson, stood near the courtroom entrance wearing an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than a month of her mother's mortgage payment. He looked like he'd walked out of a corporate magazine, the image of success, stability, and respectability. His attorney stood beside him, a sharp-faced woman with calculated hair and eyes that looked like they could dissect a human soul. Richard's expression when he caught sight of Emma, and was designed to project superiority, barely concealed contempt for them both. Emma instinctively pressed closer to her mother. Copper sensed the shift in her energy immediately, his ears perking up, his body language changing from casual walk to protective stance. The dog had been trained for situations like this, though Emma had never been explicitly told as much. Dr. Sarah, her therapist, simply referred to him as her support companion, someone who could help during difficult moments. Emma suspected Doctor had actually trained Copper for the specific stress of custody litigation, but they hadn't discussed it directly. "Deep breaths," her mother reminded her, "just like we practice with Doctor." But Emma's breaths came shallow and fast, like she was drowning in air. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the autumn morning. She wondered if her father had been telling his attorney about the time Emma had a panic attack at school last month. Had he framed it as evidence of her mother's neglect? Had he suggested that only he could provide the stability she needed? The fear of not knowing what accusations were being leveled against her mother was almost worse than the accusations themselves. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was sterile and intimidating. Everything was designed to convey authority and consequence. The elevated judge's bench, the wood paneling, the American flag, the court reporter sitting at her desk with her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to record every word, every pause, every emotional crack. The gallery benches were arranged like church pews, and Emma's therapist sat in the third row, her presence a small comfort. Doctor offered a subtle nod, not a smile, which would be inappropriate, but a silent acknowledgement of Emma's courage. Judge entered through a side door, her black robes creating the impression of an all-knowing oracle. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in the room simultaneously. Emma had researched her online, discovering that Judge had a reputation for being exceptionally fair, but unforgiving of what she considered manipulative behavior. The question was whether Emma's mother would be seen as the manipulative one for allegedly weaponizing mental health, or whether the judge would see through such rhetoric to the actual truth. Judge's gaze landed on Copper, and her expression shifted into what could only be described as irritation. She set down her file and folded her hands, regarding the dog with obvious disapproval. "I agreed to the dog only because of the therapist's letter," Judge announced crisply, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "However, I want to be clear. This animal will cause no disruptions, any inappropriate behavior, and it will be removed immediately. And no, the dog will not be testifying." A few muffled coughs in the gallery that were barely concealed laughs at the judge's attempt at levity, but Emma didn't find it funny. The judge's tone had been dismissive, even hostile. She'd already decided that Copper was a prop, a gimmick, perhaps even evidence of manipulation. That prejudgment settled in Emma's chest like a stone. "This is going to be harder than we thought," whispered. Emma realized in that moment that they were facing more than just a custody battle. They were facing a judge who seemed predisposed to view Copper's presence skeptically. That skepticism could extend to everything they presented as evidence, every therapeutic note, every doctor's recommendation, every moment of genuine connection between Emma and her mother. The judge had already begun the process of discrediting them before a single word of testimony had been spoken. Copper pressed against Emma's leg, his warm body solid and real beneath her fingertips. She held on to his presence like an anchor, wondering if the judge could see what she saw, that this dog wasn't a manipulation tactic, but a genuine tool that helped her survive the unsurvivable. As they moved toward the plaintiff's table, Emma caught sight of her father's attorney whispering something to Richard, and his expression transformed into something that looked like confidence bordering on smugness. They believed they were winning before the battle had even begun. Emma's heart sank. She had expected this to be difficult, but she hadn't fully grasped how difficult until this moment. The realization hit her with full force. No one was going to help her except her mother and her dog. The judge was already predisposed against them. The system itself felt hostile, and yet, somehow, she had to find the courage to speak her truth in a place designed to make truth feel irrelevant. Copper rested his head on her lap, and Emma held on to him like her life depended on it. Because in a very real sense, it did. Richard Richardson stood from the defendant's table with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested he'd practiced this moment in a mirror. His movements were calculated to project confidence without arrogance, the delicate balance of a man who'd been coached extensively by his attorneys. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the witness chair with an expression of concerned sincerity that made Emma's stomach twist into knots. The courtroom was now packed with observers. Word had spread through the courthouse that this was a particularly contentious custody case, and several lawyers had taken breaks from their own cases to watch. Emma felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She was of every detail. The way the court reporter's fingers moved across her stenotype machine, the way Judge leaned back in her chair with an expression of measured neutrality, the way her mother's attorney, Mr. David Torres, was writing furious notes on his legal pad. Richard's attorney, the sharp-faced woman whose name was, approached him with warm familiarity. "Mr. Richardson, can you tell the court about your concerns regarding your daughter's current living situation?" Richard took a moment before speaking, as if the weight of his words was so significant that he needed to pause out of respect for their importance. The theatrical pause was effective. Even Judge seemed to lean forward slightly, drawn in by the performance. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice steady and measured, "I love my daughter more than anything in this world. This case isn't about taking her away from her mother out of spite. It's about protecting her from a situation that has become increasingly unstable and damaging. He paused again, letting the implications settle over the courtroom like fog. Emma felt Copper's ears perk up, the dog sensing the shift in her breathing, the acceleration of her heartbeat. "My ex-wife struggles with significant mental health issues," Richard continued. "Over the past 18 months, I've watched these struggles intensify. There have been days when Emma comes to my house and tells me her mother hasn't gotten out of bed, days when she skipped school because was too unwell to drive her." It was a lie, a detailed, plausible lie built on fragments of truth twisted beyond recognition. Yes, Emma's mother had depression. Yes, there had been difficult days. But the full context, that her mother was receiving treatment, that she was working with doctor, that Emma had never missed school because of her mother's mental health, that didn't matter in a courtroom where narrative was king. "Just last month," Richard said, his voice dropping to convey concern, "Emma called me at work crying. She said her mother had forgotten about her parent-teacher conference and that she felt abandoned. How is that the behavior of a stable, attentive parent?" Emma's hands clenched into fists. That conference had been rescheduled by the school without her mother's knowledge. When Emma reminded her, her mother had rearranged her entire work schedule to attend. But the truth was complex, and complexity had no place in a courtroom designed for verdicts. "There's more," Richard continued, and Emma saw him glance in her direction, a subtle move designed to suggest they were connected in their suffering. "This medication regimen is inconsistent. I've observed Emma mentioning that her mother sometimes forgets whether she's taken her pills. That's not the behavior of someone in control of her mental health. That's the behavior of someone in crisis." It was a technique Emma now understood her father had perfected. Take something true and harmless, then frame it as evidence of catastrophic failure. Yes, her mother sometimes forgot if she'd taken her medication. Most people did. That's why pill organizers existed. It didn't mean her mother was irresponsible or in crisis. But to someone unfamiliar with the realities of managing mental health, the accusation landed hard. Emma watched Judge's expression, trying to read her thoughts. The judge was writing notes, her face revealing nothing. But the act of writing itself seemed significant. The judge was taking Richard's accusations seriously enough to document them. "Most concerningly," Richard said, his voice now trembling with what might have been genuine emotion or brilliant acting, "I believe is using Emma as an emotional support system. She's made Emma responsible for her own mental health management. Emma worries constantly about her mother. She's developed anxiety, which I believe is directly caused by the stress of her home environment. That's making a child responsible for a parent's emotional. It's a form of emotional abuse." That accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. Emotional abuse. The words hung in the air, and she felt tears burning behind her eyes. She wanted to stand up and shout that it was the opposite, that her mother had done everything possible to protect her from the burden of her mental health challenges, that her mother had specifically sought therapy to make sure she wasn't placing that burden on Emma. But the rules of courtroom decorum demanded silence. Beside her, Emma's mother had gone completely still. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her fingernails were probably leaving marks in her palms. Mr. Torres reached over and patted his arm, but it was a gesture of sympathy rather than reassurance. They both knew how damaging Richard's testimony was being. Copper shifted against Emma's leg, sensing the spike in her anxiety. The dog didn't perform any particular trained behavior yet, just pressed closer, offered his weight, grounded her in the present moment. Emma held onto that presence like a lifeline. Richard concluded his main testimony with a, "I'm not here to punish or take Emma away from her mother. I'm here because I believe Emma would be better served in a stable environment where she's not carrying the emotional weight of her parents' mental health crisis. That's not punishment. That's love." When his attorney, Mr. Torres, stood to cross-examine Richard, Emma hoped desperately that he would dismantle these accusations, expose the lies and distortions. But as she watched Mr. Torr's attempts to question Richard's narrative, she realized something that chilled her. Richard had crafted his story too carefully. Every accusation was based on just enough truth that it couldn't be completely refuted. Every exaggeration was subtle enough that it sounded plausible. Every implication was wrapped in language that suggested Richard was acting out of paternal concern rather than vindictiveness. Judge's expression remained neutral, but Emma thought she detected something in the judge's eyes, the look of someone who believed what they'd just heard. The judge believed her father. Emma felt the courtroom tilting slightly. Copper pressed harder against her leg, as if the dog knew that something fundamental had just shifted in their favor, or more accurately, against it. The judge was no longer an impartial arbiter. She was someone who just heard a compelling story about a mother who was failing her daughter. And Emma's mother would have to somehow overcome that narrative. As the morning session broke for lunch, Emma caught sight of her father leaving the courtroom. He didn't look at her, but she saw him exchange a confident nod with his attorney. They believed they'd won. And watching the way Judge collected her documents before descending from the bench, Emma feared they might be right. The afternoon sun streamed through the courtroom windows at a merciless angle, illuminating every imperfection in the room. Emma sat in the gallery beside Copper, trying to be invisible, trying to disappear into the wooden bench beneath her. But invisibility wasn't an option. Not anymore. After lunch, after Richard's devastating testimony had settled into the minds of everyone present, after Judge's expression had shifted from neutral to subtly skeptical, it was Emma's turn. "We call Emma Richardson to the stand," Mr. Torres announced. The words fell like a guillotine blade. Emma's entire body went numb. She'd prepared for this moment with Doctor for weeks. They'd done mock cross-examinations. They'd practiced breathing exercises. They'd discussed what to expect, how to handle aggressive questions, how to stay calm and centered. But no amount of preparation could have adequately her for the actual moment when she had to stand up in front of everyone, in front of her father, in front of Judge, in front of the court reporter, who would record every stammered word she spoke. Copper immediately rose when Emma stood. The bailiff reached down to stop the dog, but Emma held up her hand. "He's allowed," she said quietly, her voice already wavering. "He's my emotional support animal." Judge nodded curtly, apparently deciding that allowing Copper beside her was the lesser of evils compared to having Emma completely dissolve on the stand. Emma led Copper to the witness box, her legs feeling like they were made of water, like she might collapse at any moment. The bailiff held out the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Emma whispered. She sat in the witness chair, suddenly of its physical discomfort. The hard wood, the slight squeak as she shifted her weight, the way it elevated her slightly above the normal floor level, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. She was a child in an adult courtroom, surrounded by people trained in rhetoric and manipulation, about to be questioned by a man whose job was to make her testimony seem unreliable. Mr. Torres approached gently. "Emma, can you tell the court how you're feeling right now?" "Scared," Emma admitted, and she felt the authenticity of that single word resonate through the courtroom. "That's completely understandable," Mr. Torres said warmly. "But I want you to know that all we're asking for is the truth. Just answer the questions as honestly as you can. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, and Mr. Torres began with softball questions designed to establish her credibility. How old was she? When was her birthday? What school did she attend? What were her favorite subjects? The questions felt safe, manageable. Emma's voice grew slightly stronger as she answered them. Then came the real questions. "Emma, you mentioned in your statement to the family investigator that your mother sometimes has bad days. Can you tell the court what you meant by that?" Emma took a breath, thinking of her therapist's instructions. Be specific, be honest, don't overstate or understate. "My mom, she has depression. Sometimes the medication helps her feel better, but sometimes she still has days where she feels sad and doesn't have as much energy. But she always takes care of me. She makes sure I eat. She helps me with my homework. But she has these bad days, correct? Mr. Torres pressed gently. Days when she doesn't have energy. Yes, but... And on those days, does she spend time in her bedroom rather than with you? Sometimes, but she... And when she's having these bad days, who do you talk to about your own feelings? Who do you go to for support? Emma hesitated. Sometimes when her mother was having a particularly difficult day, Emma had called her father. Sometimes she journaled. Sometimes she'd talk to doctor. But saying any of this out loud made it sound worse than it was, like she was being neglected. I talk to my mom when she's feeling better, Emma said carefully. And I have doctor, my therapist. So you need a therapist to process your feelings. The opposing counsel suddenly interjected during cross-examination. Isn't that what your mother should be doing? Emma's mouth went dry. I like having a therapist. She helps me understand my feelings. But that's not normal for children, is it, Emma? Most children don't need professional mental health services. I don't know, Emma stammered. Doctor said it was good for me. Smiled, but it was a predatory smile. She was circling, identifying weakness. Let me ask you something else, Emma. Has your mother ever told you about her own therapy sessions? Has she ever discussed her mental health struggles with you? No, So she hides her mental health issues from you. She doesn't hide them. I just know she sees a doctor. A doctor she needs to see regularly to manage her mental health condition, correct? This is something your mother is struggling with significantly, isn't it? Each question was a small trap. Emma could see the pattern now. The attorney was taking normal, manageable facts and framing them as evidence of maternal instability. The trap was that telling the truth made things sound worse, but lying would be perjury. My mom manages her mental health, Emma said, her voice becoming smaller. She works hard to take care of me. But she has limitations, doesn't she? Pressed forward. There are days she simply can't be the parent you need, isn't that true? Emma felt tears threatening to spill over her cheeks. She glanced toward her mother in the gallery and saw looking at her with an expression of such anguish, such helplessness, that Emma's throat tightened. She does her best, Emma whispered. That's not an answer to my question, said smoothly. Isn't it true that your father provides you with more stability, that you feel safer with him? The question was designed to elicit a specific answer. Emma understood now that this entire cross-examination was choreographed, that had planned out the narrative arc before she'd even begun questioning Emma. Every answer, no matter how Emma phrased it, would be twisted into evidence against her mother. My dad makes me feel uncomfortable sometimes, Emma said quietly. He says mean things about my mom. He's expressing his concerns about her mental health. He calls her crazy, Emma said, her voice strengthening slightly through her tears. He tells me that living with her is dangerous, but he's lying. My mom isn't dangerous, she's just struggling. His expression hardened fractionally. She'd encountered resistance. She pivoted smoothly. Emma, after your parents' separation, has your mother ever asked you to keep secrets from your father? Has she ever asked you to choose between them? No, Emma said. Has your father? Emma hesitated. Richard had done exactly that, asked her not to tell her mother about conversations they'd had, suggested that Emma should report to him about her mother's condition, implied that Emma needed to be his eyes and ears. Yes, Emma admitted, and she saw her father shift in his seat, his expression tightening with anger at her honesty. By the time finished her cross-examination an hour later, Emma was completely depleted. Her voice had become increasingly quiet and uncertain. She'd contradicted herself twice, not because she was lying, but because complex human truths don't fit neatly into yes or no questions. She'd cried 3 times. She'd looked helplessly at her mother twice. And most damaging of all, she'd given the impression of a confused, traumatized child rather than a girl with a stable, supportive relationship. Judge watched Emma climb down from the witness stand, with an expression that suggested the judge had made up her mind about what she'd heard. Copper moved immediately to Emma's side, sensing the devastation radiating from her. The dog pressed against her leg, but even his familiar presence couldn't shake the feeling that she'd failed everyone who mattered, her mother herself, the truth itself. As Emma returned to her seat in the gallery, her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "You did amazing," whispered, but they both knew it was a lie. Emma had told the truth, and it hadn't been enough. Emma sat back down in the gallery with the weight of failure crushing her chest. She'd been on the stand for nearly 90 minutes, and with each passing minute, she'd felt the courtroom's sympathy slipping away like water through her fingers. Judge had returned to her position on the bench with an expression that could only be described as disappointed, not in Emma, but in what Emma's testimony had revealed about her mother's alleged failures. Returned to her seat with the satisfied demeanor of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. She exchanged a brief glance with Richard, and that glance contained something worse than triumph. It contained certainty. They believed they'd won. More troubling, based on the judge's body language, they might have been right. Mr. Torres stood to present more evidence. He called a school counselor who that Emma's grades were excellent, that she showed no signs of neglect or abuse, that her attendance record was spotless. He called a pediatrician who confirmed Emma had regular checkups and was physically healthy. He called doctor, who explained in clinical detail how therapy had helped Emma develop coping mechanisms for anxiety, and that her mother's active participation in every session was remarkable and rare. But none of it seemed to penetrate the narrative that had been established. Judge listened politely to each witness but took far fewer notes than she had during Richard's testimony. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Emma recognized the micro-expressions, the slight pursing of her lips, the way her eyes moved to Richard and then back to the witness stand. The judge had already decided. Everything else was just procedural theater. It was late afternoon now. The October sun had shifted, and the shadows in the courtroom had moved, now darkening Judge's face in a way that made her expression even more severe. The courtroom was becoming stuffy and close. Emma could feel the air pressing down on her, the weight of every eye, every expectation, every accusation. Then stood for her closing arguments, and Emma felt something inside her begin to fracture. "Your Honor," began, her voice carrying the authority of someone completely confident in her position, "the evidence is clear. While I have the utmost sympathy for Ms. Richardson's mental health struggles that are clearly genuine and significant, the question before this court is not whether she loves her daughter. Of course she does. The question is whether she is stable enough to be the primary custodian." Paced across the front of the courtroom like an actress on a stage, commanding the space with her presence. "We've heard testimony today about depression, about medication management, about therapy sessions. We've heard a child describe being responsible for monitoring her mother's mental state. We've heard that child express relief when in her father's presence. While there are certainly issues to address regarding Mr. Richardson's communication style, these pale in comparison to the fundamental question of stability." Emma felt her stomach twisting. The case was slipping away. She wanted to stand up and scream. She wanted to tell the judge that was lying through implication, that she was taking her mother's honest struggle with mental health and weaponizing it into evidence of unfitness. But there was no mechanism for that. There was no opportunity for truth to interrupt the narrative once it had been established. Mr. Torres rose for his rebuttal, but his words sounded hollow, defensive, reactive. He was trying to counter a story rather than tell one. Judge announced that she would render her decision after reviewing the case file overnight. The courtroom began to empty, but Emma sat frozen in her seat, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Her mother approached, trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. "We'll regroup," said, reaching down to squeeze Emma's shoulder. "Tomorrow, after she reviews everything." But they both knew that judges didn't reverse their initial impressions overnight. Judge had already made up her mind. That evening, Emma couldn't eat dinner. She sat at her mother's kitchen table, mechanically pushing food around her plate while tried to make small talk about nothing. Copper lay at Emma's feet, occasionally nudging her hand with his nose, sensing the despair radiating from her small body. By 9 a.m. the next morning, they were back in the courtroom. Judge had the file in front of her. She began reading through her prepared decision, and every sentence felt like a hammer blow. The judge commended Ms. Richardson for seeking treatment and attempting to manage her condition. She acknowledged Mr. Richardson's pattern of dismissive communication toward Emma's mother, but then came the fatal words. However, the preponderance of evidence suggests that the primary residence should be established with Mr. Richardson. While Ms. Richardson is clearly a loving parent, the child's testimony indicated a concerning pattern of an emotional burden. The stability required for optimal child development appears more readily available in the paternal home. Emma's vision blurred. She gripped Copper's leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. That was when stood for her closing remarks, a privilege the judge had granted the defense. "Thank you, Your Honor, for this wise decision. We believe that with supervised visitation and appropriate mental health support, Ms. Richardson can rebuild her relationship with her daughter in a healthier context." The words were perfunctory, a victory lap for someone who'd successfully destroyed a family in service of a client's custody agenda. But as spoke, something inside Emma broke completely. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The courtroom seemed to tilt and spin. She could feel her heart racing, her vision narrowing, the characteristic symptoms of a full-blown anxiety attack that had become all too familiar over the past months. This was it. This was the moment when everything fell apart. She would lose her mother. She would be trapped in her father's house where he spoke about her mother with contempt. She would wake up in a different bedroom tomorrow. The panic was overwhelming, consuming, all-encompassing. Emma's hands began to shake. Her throat tightened. She couldn't breathe properly, couldn't focus on anything except the mounting terror that she was experiencing in front of everyone. Then, in that moment of absolute desperation, when she felt herself sinking beneath an ocean of anxiety and fear, Emma did what Doctor had taught her to do. She reached down and placed her palm firmly against her own chest, right over her heart, and pressed 3 times in the specific pattern they'd practiced hundreds of times. The signal. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. And in that fraction of a second, Emma wondered if Copper had forgotten, if the training had been inadequate, if this too would fail her like everything else today. Then Copper moved. The golden retriever bolted from his sitting position with sudden, decisive purpose. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Judge's hand came up, silencing him with an authoritative gesture. Everyone in the courtroom froze, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Copper approached Emma and, with the precision of months of training, performed a deep pressure technique. He stood up on his hind legs and leaned his full body weight against Emma's trembling frame. His massive 70-pound body pressed firmly against her legs, her torso, his warmth spreading through her like a physical anchor. His positioning was therapeutic, deliberate, absolutely unmistakable in its intentionality. The courtroom had gone silent. Every single person in that room understood simultaneously. This wasn't a random dog behavior. This was trained. This was real. This was a child who had been taught not just to survive trauma, but to signal for help when she desperately needed it. Judge's expression transformed. Her eyes widened slightly. She leaned forward, watching the interaction with sudden, intense focus. The skepticism that had characterized her demeanor all morning evaporated, replaced by something that looked like dawning understanding. Emma's breathing began to regulate. Copper's weight grounded her, brought her back to the present moment, reminded her that she wasn't alone. She wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of defeat, but tears of release, of her body finally being allowed to process the trauma of the past 48 hours. And in that moment, everything changed. Judge's entire body went rigid. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink for a long moment. She simply watched as the golden retriever performed what was unmistakably a trained therapeutic response to a child in crisis. The judge's hand was still raised, still maintaining the silence she'd imposed on the courtroom, and in that silence she was processing something profound. 32 years on the bench. That was her tenure. 32 years of custody cases, of custody disputes, of parents claiming to act in their children's best interests while often acting purely out of revenge, vindictiveness, or financial motivation. She'd seen it all. She'd developed what she considered to be an accurate instinct for detecting manipulation, deception, and parental unfitness. She prided herself on her ability to see through performance and identify truth. But she'd made an error today. As Judge watched Emma hold Copper, as she observed the precise nature of the dog's response, as she recognized the therapeutic intentionality behind every movement, something shifted fundamentally in her perception of the entire case. The skepticism that had characterized her demeanor all morning, skepticism that Emma's mother was truly struggling, skepticism that Copper served a legitimate purpose beyond manipulation, crumbled like ancient stone. This wasn't manipulation. Manipulation was crude. Manipulation was calculated to impress a judge. This was something else entirely. This was a child who'd been taught to advocate for her own mental health. This was a child who'd been given tools to survive. This was a child who'd been supported by a parent who understood that mental health struggles were real and required professional intervention. Judge's gaze shifted to Emma's mother, Richardson, who was now standing, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The judge observed something she'd somehow missed before. The anguish on his face wasn't performative. It was the genuine distress of a mother watching her child suffer and being largely powerless to prevent it. It was the distress of a person who'd sat through an entire day of testimony that systematized and weaponized her mental health struggles. Then the judge's eyes moved to Richard Richardson. His expression had shifted dramatically. The confident smugness had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like confusion. He'd expected the judge's decision to hold, for the case to conclude with him as the victor. He wasn't prepared for this disruption. Leaned over to whisper something to him, her own expression showing cracks in her composed exterior. Judge finally lowered her hand and looked directly at Emma. The judge's expression contained something Emma had never seen from her before, genuine compassion mixed with something that looked like professional humility. The judge realized that she'd been wrong, not partially wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally, categorically wrong about the nature of this case. But that realization created a problem. The judge had already issued her decision. She'd read it into the record. She declared custody awarded to the father. Under normal circumstances, that decision would stand unless significant new evidence emerged that substantially changed the facts of the case. A dog performing a trained behavior, while affecting, might not meet the legal threshold for vacating a decision already rendered. Judge needed to understand more. She needed to comprehend not just what she'd witnessed, but what it meant within the context of the larger case. The judge looked at the court reporter. "Stop the record," she said. Then she turned to the gallery. "I want to see the therapist in chambers, now." Dr. Sarah stood immediately, already understanding that this moment was critical. As she passed Emma, the therapist placed a hand briefly on the girl's shoulder, a gesture of encouragement and validation. Emma felt something shift inside her. An adult had witnessed her signal to Copper. An adult had recognized its significance. An adult was now going to ensure that significance was properly understood. The courtroom was in controlled chaos. Bailiffs were conferring with attorneys. Spectators were whispering urgently to each other. Richard Richardson looked increasingly agitated, sensing that something was unraveling. Judge called both attorneys into chambers along with the court reporter, leaving Emma and her mother in a state of suspended animation in the courtroom. Pulled Emma close, and for the first time since the trial began, Emma allowed herself to hope. In chambers, Judge was direct. "Doctor, explain to me what I just witnessed." Doctor didn't hesitate. She understood that this was her moment to provide context. "Your Honor, Emma has severe anxiety disorder. When she's under extreme stress, like during courtroom testimony or aggressive cross-examination, she can experience anxiety attacks that are physiologically overwhelming." "And the signal?" Judge asked. "A trained coping mechanism. Emma learned to recognize her body's stress signals: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, tunnel vision, emotional dysregulation. When she experiences these symptoms, she was taught to signal copper. The dog performs deep pressure therapy, applying body weight to help regulate her nervous system." "How long have you been working with Emma?" 18 months. Throughout that entire time, her mother attended every single session. We worked together as a team. Father, he never attended one session. He didn't believe his daughter's anxiety was real." Judge felt something bitter settle in her chest. She'd reversed her entire understanding of the case based on this information. She'd made her decision based on testimony and narrative, not on this deeper truth about parental support and genuine mental health advocacy. "Your Honor," interjected, "while this is compelling, a trained dog performing a behavior doesn't change the substantive evidence regarding Ms. Richardson's stability." "Doesn't it?" Judge replied coolly. "It demonstrates that Ms. Richardson is actively involved in her daughter's mental health care. It demonstrates that she's committed enough to that care to support professional therapy interventions. It demonstrates that while she may struggle with her own mental health, she's prioritizing her daughter's above her own struggles. That's not the profile of an unfit parent. That's the profile of a parent doing the hard work of responsible parenting." Mr. Torres spoke up, his voice steady. "Your Honor, this also suggests something about the child's testimony. Emma appeared hesitant and uncertain during cross-examination, not because her testimony was unreliable, but because she was experiencing genuine anxiety. The opposing counsel's aggressive questioning style may have actually induced the very symptoms we're discussing." Judge turned to Richard. "And yet you've never sought help for this anxiety. You've instead characterized it as your ex-wife's problem, as evidence of her unfitness." She turned back to Doctor. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, what would be the psychological impact of removing this child from the primary care of the parent who has been actively supporting her mental health treatment?" "Catastrophic," Doctor said flatly. "She would experience significant regression in her anxiety management. She would lose the support system she's come to depend on. The inconsistency would likely exacerbate her symptoms dramatically." Judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she looked up again, her expression was one of someone who just realized she'd been about to make a decision that could have caused serious psychological harm to a child. "We're reconvening in 10 minutes, Judge announced. "I'm vacating my previous decision. We're going back on the record, and I'm hearing additional evidence regarding the significance of this therapeutic relationship." As Doctor left chambers, she caught sight of Emma in the gallery. The judge also saw the girl's terrified expression, the way Emma was still holding copper, the way her entire body seemed to be holding its breath. Judge realized with sudden clarity that she'd been about to make a decision based on incomplete information. She'd been about to separate a child from the one parent who'd recognized her struggles and done the professional, difficult work of supporting her through them. And it had taken a 12-year-old child's courage and a trained dog's love to prevent that catastrophic mistake. The courtroom reconvened with a palpable sense of transformation. The afternoon light had shifted again, now casting the room in that golden, late autumn glow that made everything seem somehow more significant, more consequential. Judge took her position on the bench, and her expression was markedly different from the morning, less impassive, more engaged, with an intensity that suggested she was actively working through something that troubled her professionally and ethically. "Before we proceed," Judge announced, "I have several questions for Dr. Sarah regarding the therapeutic relationship with Emma and the nature of the training we witnessed earlier." Stood immediately. "Your Honor, I object. This is highly irregular. The therapist has already—" Judge cut her off with quiet authority. "I'm the judge in this case. I have the discretion to ask for clarification on evidence that was presented. Please be seated." Sat, her jaw clenching visibly. She could sense the momentum shifting, and she was powerless to prevent it. Doctor returned to the witness stand, and she carried herself with the confident composure of someone who was finally going to be able to tell the complete truth, rather than answering leading questions designed to trap her into partial statements. Judge began directly. "Doctor, I witnessed Emma perform what appeared to be a trained signal to her dog. Can you explain to the court exactly what I observed and what it signifies?" "Yes, Your Honor," Doctor said, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "What you witnessed is part of a comprehensive anxiety management program we developed specifically for Emma. When a child experiences severe anxiety, their body begins a cascade of physical responses: elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, muscle tension, what's sometimes called fight, flight, or freeze responses." She paused, ensuring the judge was following. Judge was leaning forward, completely focused. "Emma's anxiety," Doctor continued, "often manifests in high-stress situations like courtroom testimony. We worked together to help her recognize these physical signals before they became completely overwhelming. The signal you witnessed, the 3 taps on her chest, is Emma's way of communicating that she's reaching a critical point where she needs grounding support." "And Copper's response?" the judge asked. "Deep pressure therapy. It's a well-documented therapeutic technique where applying sustained pressure to a person's body helps regulate their nervous system. Copper was trained specifically to respond to Emma's signal by providing that pressure in exactly the way Emma's body needs it. The precision of his response, the timing, the amount of pressure, all of this was months of careful training." Judge made notes, but her expression suggested she was doing more than documenting facts. She was reconstructing her understanding of the entire case. "Doctor, throughout this training period, who participated in Emma's therapy?" This was the question that would prove to be the entire case. "Emma's mother attended every single session," Doctor said clearly. "Every appointment for 18 months. Not once did Ms. Richardson miss a session. She participated actively in the training process. She learned the signals. She practiced the techniques with Emma at home. She was instrumental in helping Emma develop these coping mechanisms." Judge's expression remained neutral, but Emma could see something shift in her posture, a slight straightening, a subtle indication that this testimony was significant. "And Mr. Richardson," Judge asked, "did he participate in this therapeutic process?" "No, Your Honor. I extended multiple invitations to Mr. Richardson to attend sessions. He declined every single one. He expressed skepticism about the necessity of therapy, suggested that Emma's anxiety was exaggerated or being encouraged by her mother, and refused to learn the coping techniques or support mechanisms that were being developed." In the gallery, Richard's face flushed red. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently, but he waved her away with visible irritation. Stood, "Doctor, isn't it true that Mr. Richardson may have declined participation because he didn't believe these sessions were in Emma's best interest? That's a valid parental prerogative, isn't it?" "It's a parental choice, certainly," Doctor agreed. "But it's worth noting that by declining to participate, Mr. Richardson had no understanding of what Emma was learning, no ability to support her coping strategies outside of therapy, and no investment in her mental health management. Meanwhile, Ms. Richardson integrated these strategies into their daily life. She practiced breathing exercises with Emma. She helped her identify anxiety triggers. She supported her daughter's mental health actively and consistently. But Ms. Richardson uses medication for her own mental health, pressed. Doesn't that create concerns about her ability to objectively support her daughter's mental health? On the contrary, Doctor responded, and there was a subtle edge to her voice now, the tone of someone who'd heard this argument too many times. Ms. Richardson's willingness to seek treatment for her own mental health challenges demonstrates that she understands the value of professional help. It shows her daughter that mental health struggles are real, manageable, and nothing to be ashamed of. It models healthy help-seeking behavior. Research shows that children of parents who actively manage their mental health actually develop better coping mechanisms than children whose parents deny or hide their struggles. Judge looked at Emma now, studying the girl with clear understanding. She could see it, a child who'd been taught that mental health matters, that getting help is responsible and not shameful, that coping skills are something you develop and practice and refine. Doctor, Judge said, in your professional assessment, what would be the impact on Emma of losing her primary relationship with Ms. Richardson and moving into primary custody with Mr. Richardson? Objected immediately, but Judge overruled her. It would be extremely damaging, Doctor said, her voice carrying genuine conviction. Emma has built a complete therapeutic framework with her mother. She's learned to recognize her anxiety signals. She's developed coping mechanisms. She's been validated in her struggles. To remove her from that primary relationship would constitute, in my professional opinion, a form of therapeutic abandonment. It would likely result in significant regression in her anxiety management, loss of the support systems she's come to depend on, and substantial psychological harm. Even if her father provided her with her own therapist, pressed. Even then, Doctor said firmly, the continuity of care is already established with Ms. Richardson. The relationship is built. The trust exists. Starting over with a new therapist in a different home with a parent who's been unsupportive of her mental health needs would be profoundly destabilizing. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Everyone present understood what was happening. A mental health professional was testifying, in very direct and clear terms, that the judge's original decision would cause psychological harm to the child. Judge set down her pen slowly. Doctor, thank you for that clarity. No further questions. As Doctor stepped down from the witness stand, Emma saw something remarkable happen. Her mother, sitting in the gallery, placed her head in her hands and allowed tears to flow freely. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of validation, of recognition, of being seen and understood after hours of having her struggles systematized and weaponized. Stood to ask more questions, but her energy had visibly diminished. She could sense it too. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. A mother's commitment to her daughter's mental health, which had been presented as evidence of dysfunction and instability, was now being understood as evidence of her dedication and responsibility. Judge called for a brief recess, but before dismissing the courtroom, she looked directly at Emma. The judge's expression contained something that looked like apology mixed with recognition of a difficult truth. Emma had just watched the complete reframing of her mother's struggles. Mental illness, when coupled with active treatment and support, wasn't evidence of unfitness. It was evidence of a parent willing to do the hard work of parenting authentically. And that changed everything. The courtroom was packed for the afternoon session. Word had spread through the courthouse that something unusual was happening in Judge's chamber. Lawyers from other cases had arranged their schedules to observe. Court personnel who normally remained in back offices found reasons to be present. Everyone sensed that this verdict would be significant, not just for the parties involved, but as a commentary on how mental health and parental fitness were understood within the legal system. Emma sat in the front row of the gallery with Copper's leash held firmly in her hand. Her mother sat beside her, but they didn't touch, didn't speak. The silence between them was electric with anticipation and uncertainty. Emma had learned not to trust outcomes in this courtroom. She'd learned that judges could decide things that seemed unjust. She'd learned that truth wasn't always enough. Judge entered from her chamber, and the courtroom rose. The judge took her position on the bench and looked directly at Emma before turning to address the full courtroom. Her expression was grave, thoughtful, carrying the weight of a decision that she'd clearly labored over. "This has been an unusually difficult case," Judge began, her voice measured and deliberate. "Not because the facts were unclear, but because I initially allowed narrative and presentation to overshadow substantive evidence. I made an error this morning, and before I deliver my corrected decision, I want to acknowledge that error publicly." There was a visible reaction throughout the courtroom. Judges rarely admitted mistakes. "I rendered an initial custody decision based primarily on testimony that characterized mental health challenges as evidence of parental unfitness," Judge continued. "That initial decision was, upon further reflection and upon hearing more complete evidence, fundamentally unjust." Richard Richardson's attorney leaned over and whispered something to him, her expression alarmed. "What I witnessed this afternoon changed my understanding of this case completely," the judge said. "I observed a child perform a trained coping mechanism. That mechanism wasn't random. It was the product of months of therapeutic work. And critically, that therapeutic work was conducted with the full participation and support of Emma's mother." Judge adjusted her glasses and picked up her file. "I've reviewed the evidence in its entirety. I've considered the testimony of Emma's therapist, her pediatrician, her school counselor, and most importantly, I've considered Emma's own testimony in its proper context, that of a child experiencing genuine anxiety in an extraordinarily stressful situation." She paused, and the silence in the courtroom felt heavy with significance. "I want to address something that troubled me about this case," Judge continued. "Mental illness is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of poor parenting. What distinguishes good parents from poor parents in the context of mental health challenges is not whether they struggle, many people do, but how they respond to those struggles." The judge's gaze moved to Richardson. Ms. Richardson responded to her mental health challenges by seeking professional treatment. She responded by participating actively in her daughter's therapeutic care. She responded by validating her daughter's struggles and investing in her daughters. These are not the actions of an unfit parent. These are the actions of a dedicated, responsible parent. His hand covered her mouth, and tears began streaming down her face. "Mr. Richardson responded differently," Judge said, her tone shifting subtly. "He refused to participate in his daughter's therapeutic care. He characterized his daughter's genuine anxiety as exaggeration or manipulation. He used his daughter's mental health struggles that her mother was actively and professionally addressing, as evidence against that mother's fitness. That is not the behavior of a parent acting in his child's best interest." Emma felt something shift in the courtroom's energy. People were leaning forward. Everyone was completely focused on Judge's words. 32 years on this bench have taught me to recognize when a parent is truly acting out of concern for their child, and when they're acting out of other motivations. I observed in Mr. Richardson's testimony a concerning pattern of using his daughter's vulnerability as leverage in this custody dispute. I observed a father more interested in winning than in understanding his daughter's actual needs. She turned to Emma directly. "Young lady, I want to commend your courage. Coming to testify in this courtroom is extraordinarily difficult for any child, but for a child with anxiety disorder, it was truly remarkable. Your signal to Copper, that was not weakness. That was strength. That was you advocating for yourself and your own. That was you demonstrating emotional intelligence and self-awareness that frankly exceeds what many adults possess." Emma felt tears beginning to form. This judge, the judge who'd seemed so hostile that morning, was acknowledging her bravery. This court finds that primary custody of Emma Richardson shall remain with her mother, Richardson, judge announced. Emma will have regular visitation with her father, consisting of alternating weekends and one evening per week, pending the following conditions. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Condition 1. Mr. Richardson must complete a court-ordered parenting course focused on recognizing and supporting mental health challenges in children. This course must be completed within 6 months. Condition 2. Mr. Richardson must participate in family therapy with Emma and a therapist of Emma's choosing for a minimum of 6 months. This is not optional. If Mr. Richardson refuses either of these conditions, his visitation will be suspended pending court review. Richard stood abruptly, his face purple with rage. His attorney pulled him back into his seat. Furthermore, judge continued undeterred, I want to be clear about my reasoning for this decision, and I'm having this entered into the record. The evidence demonstrates that Emma's mother has been a consistent, present, and emotionally supportive parent. The evidence further demonstrates that her active participation in Emma's mental health care is evidence of responsible parenting, not evidence of unfitness. Mental health challenges do not disqualify a parent, particularly when that parent is actively seeking treatment and modeling healthy help-seeking behavior for her child. The judge looked directly at Doctor. Doctor, I want to acknowledge the exceptional work you've done with this family. Your willingness to involve the mother, your development of practical coping strategies, your advocacy for this child's, that is the gold standard of mental health care. Doctor nodded, her expression showing quiet satisfaction and vindication. This court also notes, judge said, that the therapeutic relationship between Emma, her mother, and her therapist is established and functional. Disrupting that relationship would serve no one's interests except, perhaps, the interests of a parent seeking to punish an ex-spouse for having the audacity to struggle with mental health challenges. Judge raised her gavel. This decision is final. Custody is awarded to Richardson. Visitation is awarded to Richard Richardson contingent upon the conditions I've outlined. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and the sound reverberated through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of a war. Emma's mother gasped, then stood, pulling Emma into a tight embrace. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder and allowed herself to cry, not tears of fear or despair, but tears of relief, validation, and vindication. Copper pressed against both of them, his warm body grounding them in this moment of triumph. In the gallery, people were applauding, softly, respectfully, but undeniably. Several lawyers were shaking their heads, some in agreement with the decision, others clearly surprised by the judge's willingness to acknowledge her initial error. Richard Richardson stormed out of the courtroom without looking back, his attorney trailing behind him, both of their expressions grim. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Emma had signaled for help. Emma had been brave, and more importantly, Emma's mother had been vindicated. Her struggles with mental health, her commitment to getting help, her decision to support her daughter's therapeutic journey, all of it had been recognized as evidence of her fitness as a parent, not evidence of her failure. Judge Cott's eye as the courtroom emptied and offered a subtle nod, a gesture that might have contained an unspoken apology or a simple acknowledgement that justice, however complicated and delayed, had finally been served. 2 weeks after Judge's verdict, Emma's story exploded across social media with the kind of viral intensity that nobody could have predicted. The headline read, "Girl's trained signal to her dog convinces judge in custody battle. What happened next will make you believe in justice again." It started with a local news station picking up the story. A reporter who'd been observing the afternoon session recognized the human interest angle immediately and pitched it to her editor. Within hours, the story was on the evening news with footage of the courtroom proceedings and interviews with Judge, who'd agreed to discuss the case in unusually candid terms. "Mental health should never be used as a weapon," Judge told the camera. "What I witnessed in this case was a parent actively managing her mental health and investing in her daughters being portrayed as evidence of unfitness. That narrative is not only inaccurate, it's dangerous. It discourages people from seeking the help they need." By the next morning, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By the end of the week, it had gone international. News anchors in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia were discussing Emma's courage. Psychology websites published articles analyzing the therapeutic significance of deep pressure therapy. Mental health advocacy organizations began using clips from the trial in their awareness campaigns. Emma never sought the attention. She certainly didn't expect it. But as her story spread, something remarkable began happening. Other children started reaching out. The letters began arriving at her mother's house first, then at the courthouse, then at doctor's office. Handwritten notes from teenagers across the country who saw themselves in Emma's struggle. "I have anxiety like Emma," one letter read, written in careful cursive by a girl who couldn't have been more than 13. "Reading about her made me think that maybe I should tell my parents I need help." Another letter came from a young boy. "My dad told me my mom was crazy because she takes medicine for her brain. But the judge said that's not crazy, that's brave. Now I understand that my mom loves me, even when she has bad days." Emma kept every single letter. She started organizing them by theme: anxiety, depression, PTSD, abandonment issues. She read each one carefully, sometimes multiple times, feeling the weight of other children's struggles through their words. By month 3 after the verdict, over 500 letters had arrived. Dr. Sarah was experiencing her own unexpected transformation. Her practice, which had maintained a steady but not overwhelming caseload, suddenly had a waiting list of 3 months. Parents were calling specifically requesting doctors' therapeutic approach, wanting their children to learn the same coping mechanisms Emma had learned. Universities began reaching out asking her to speak at psychology conferences. She received an invitation to present her therapeutic model at the American Psychological Association's annual convention. But Doctor remained focused on her core mission: helping children manage anxiety and teaching parents to recognize and support their children's mental health needs. She implemented a program where she trained other therapists in her methodology, wanting to scale the impact beyond what she could accomplish alone. Richard Richardson's visitation pattern had become sporadic. He attended the mandatory parenting course, a begrudging obligation, and participated in the first few family therapy sessions before becoming increasingly resistant. Within 6 months, he'd attempted to modify the custody arrangement twice, both times unsuccessfully. Judge, having made clear her position on his motivations, had rejected both modifications with terse written opinions. Eventually, Richard moved to a different state, claiming it was for work. His visitation became even more infrequent. Emma found herself feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. She loved her father, or at least she loved the idea of a father who loved her unconditionally. But the reality of Richard had been easier to accept now that she wasn't required to maintain a relationship with him under legal compulsion. Richardson's depression didn't disappear. That wasn't the fairy tale ending that the viral narrative sometimes suggested. She still had difficult days. She still took medication. She still attended therapy regularly. But with the validation of the court decision, with the recognition that her struggles didn't disqualify her from being a good mother, something fundamental shifted in how she related to her mental health challenges. She stopped seeing her illness as a failure and started seeing it as a part of her that she managed responsibly. She became more open with Emma about her own therapeutic journey, modeling healthy coping strategies, demonstrating that mental health care was ongoing work, not something you finished. 6 months after the verdict, Emma approached her mother with an idea that had been germinating in her mind since the 3rd month of letters arriving. "I want to start a nonprofit," Emma said. "Signal Strength. It would help kids learn about anxiety, teach them coping mechanisms, and train emotional support animals." Looked at her daughter, this girl who'd been through so much, who displayed such courage in court, who'd been receiving letters from children across the country, and recognized that Emma was ready for this. Signal Strength was officially registered as a nonprofit organization 6 months later. The organization's mission was threefold: to educate children about anxiety and mental health, to teach practical coping mechanisms like the techniques Emma had learned, and to train and place emotional support animals with children who needed them. The organization also took on a policy advocacy component, working with legislators to ensure that mental health treatment was recognized as a sign of responsible parenting, not evidence of unfitness. Judge became the organization's first board member. She used her judicial platform to champion mental health awareness in schools, speaking at assemblies about recognizing anxiety in children and supporting, rather than stigmatizing mental health challenges. Dr. served as the organization's clinical director, developing therapeutic protocols and training other mental health professionals in Signal Strength's methodology. Within 2 years, Signal Strength had trained 40 emotional support dogs, established programs in 12 schools, and reached over 3,000 children through its mental health education curriculum. Emma, now 14, became the public face of the organization, not because anyone forced her into that role, but because she'd learned something profound in that courtroom: that her voice mattered, that sharing her story could help others, and that courage was contagious. She gave talks at schools about mental health. She participated in podcasts where she discussed anxiety and coping mechanisms. She became something she never expected to be: an advocate, a role model, a symbol of what courage looked like when you were terrified. On the 2-year anniversary of her courtroom signal, Emma sat in Doctor's office with Copper, now an older dog, his muzzle starting to gray, and reflected on how far they'd all come. "Do you regret it?" Doctor asked. "Going viral, having the whole world know your story?" Emma considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "it's weird having people recognize me, but then I get letters from kids who started therapy because they read about me, or parents who stopped calling their kids' mental health struggles weakness. And I think, yeah, it was worth it." She looked down at Copper, who pressed his head against her leg, a gesture of affection rather than a trained response. "Besides, Copper got to be famous. He's very proud of that." Doctor laughed, but it was a laugh full of genuine warmth and pride in this girl, who transformed her own struggle into a movement. The courtroom footage of Emma signaling Copper had been watched over 40 million times. Mental health organizations used it in their training materials. Psychology textbooks referenced it as a case study in therapeutic intervention and judicial awareness of mental health issues. But for Emma, the most meaningful impact wasn't the viral fame or the international recognition. It was the simple reality that she'd helped other children feel less alone. She'd demonstrated that mental health struggles didn't make you weak. She'd shown that asking for help was brave. And she'd proved that sometimes the smallest gesture, 3 taps on your chest, a signal to someone who loves you, could change everything.